The day Edith Atwood drove the last fence post into the hard Kansas earth, she swore to herself, and to the wide, cloudless sky above, that no man would ever drive one for her again. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat at the very edge of the Kishom Trail, where the air smelled of cattle dust and wood smoke and possibility, depending on who was doing the breathing. For Edith, it smelled mostly of hard work and a freedom she had fought tooth and nail to secure. She was 28 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, hands that were calloused from honest labor, and a pair of gray eyes that people in town had learned not to mistake for uncertain. They were not uncertain eyes. They were the eyes of a woman who had read the fine print on every document she had ever signed and regretted the ones she had not. Her husband, Thomas Atwood, had died 14 months prior, leaving behind 40 acres of Kansas grassland, a half-built barn, 2 milk cows, a mule named Cornelius who had an opinion about everything, and debts that Edith had spent most of the following year quietly paying off with money she made selling butter and eggs, and during a particularly lean February, her own embroidered table linens to a woman in Wichita who ran a boarding house. She had not mourned Thomas the way the town expected her to. She had mourned him privately, in the quiet hours before dawn when the prairie was still, and she could be honest with herself about the complicated nature of loving a man who had meant well, but had never quite figured out how to include her in the planning of their shared life. Now the debts were gone, the land was hers, and she intended to keep it that way. The fence post she had just driven marked the northeast boundary of her property, and she stood back and wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, surveying the line with a critical eye. Straight enough. The wire would go up tomorrow if the weather held. She had 40 yards of barbed wire coiled in the barn, purchased last month from a hardware merchant in town who had looked at her twice when she had asked for it, once with surprise, and once with the beginning of a patronizing smile that she had shut down by placing exact coins on the counter before he could offer to carry it to her wagon. She was loading her tools into the wagon bed when she heard hoofbeats. They came from the north, which was the direction of the property that had sat empty since old Hector Brannigan had sold it to some cattle outfit out of Texas and moved to live with his daughter in St. Louis. Edith had not thought much about the Brannigan land beyond noting that it shared a quarter-mile of her northern fence line, and she had been quietly hoping whoever bought it next would be either elderly and deaf or perpetually absent. She turned toward the sound because ignoring an approaching rider on the open Kansas plain was the kind of decision that tended to come back and bite you. The man who came over the low rise was riding a dark bay horse that moved with the easy, ground-covering stride of an animal well-trained and well-fed. The rider sat deep in the saddle in the manner of someone who had spent a very long time on horseback and had stopped thinking about it the way most people stop thinking about breathing. He was tall, she could tell even from a distance, with broad shoulders, and a worn brown hat pulled low against the late afternoon sun. As he came closer, she could make out the weathered lines of a face somewhere in its mid-30s, a jaw that needed a shave, and blue eyes that were currently reading the landscape with the same calm assessment she had been applying to her fence line. He pulled up about 20 yards away, which she appreciated. Men who rode up too close before announcing themselves were either careless or intentional about it, and neither spoke well. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she said, and did not put down the posthole digger she was holding. He took off his hat, held it against his knee in what might have been respect or might have been the motion of a man thinking. "Luke Norris," he said. "I just took the Brannigan place. Moved in this morning." Edith looked at him with the full attention of those gray eyes. "Edith Atwood," she said, "that land shares fence line with mine along the north pasture." "I know," he said. "I walked the boundary this morning. That is partly why I came over." He glanced at the fence post she had just driven, then back at her. "You do that yourself?" "I did." "Good work," he said simply, without the emphasis that would have made it condescending. She did not thank him for the assessment because she had not asked for it, but she noted that it had been offered without the particular flavor of surprise that she usually had to absorb from men who observed her working her own land. "What was the other part?" she asked. "Pardon. You said the fence line was partly why you came over. What was the other part?" He put his hat back on. "Being neighborly," he said. "That is generally what a person does when they move somewhere new." Edith looked at him for a moment that stretched just long enough to be its own kind of statement. "I manage fine on my own, Mr. Norris. I do not need assistance." Something moved in his expression, not offense, not amusement exactly, something more measured than either. "I am not offering assistance," he said. "I am introducing myself. Those are different things." She considered that. "I suppose they are," she said. "I will leave you to it then," he said, and turned his horse back toward the north. She watched him go until he crested the rise and disappeared, and then she stood for a moment in the silence of the Kansas afternoon, with the strange sensation that something had just begun that she had not agreed to. She drove home telling herself it was nothing. She unhitched Cornelius and told him it was nothing. She made cornbread and salt pork for supper and told herself, over the flame of the oil lamp, that it was absolutely nothing at all. The second time she saw Luke Norris was 4 days later, when she rode into Caldwell for supplies. The town had the particular energy of a cattle trail terminus in the late spring, drovers moving up from Texas, merchants restocking in anticipation of a profitable summer, and the saloons already doing business that was more optimistic than wise. Edith navigated the main street with the efficiency of a woman who had a list, a budget, and no desire to linger. She tied Cornelius's reins to the post outside Haverson's general store and went in with her basket over her arm. She was examining flour sacks when she became aware of a conversation happening at the counter that involved her neighbor's name. The storekeeper, a round-faced man named Gil Haverson, was talking with 2 ranchers whose cattle she recognized from the trail south of town. They were discussing the Brannigan land, and one of them, a heavy-set man named Denton, whom Edith had always found unpleasantly familiar, was saying that the new owner had turned down an offer to join a shared water rights agreement that gave Denton's operation priority access to the creek that ran along the western edge of the old Brannigan property. "That creek also feeds my north pasture," Edith said from the flour sacks, without raising her voice. The men at the counter turned. Denton's expression went through several adjustments before settling on something that passed for politeness. "Mrs. Atwood," he said, "I did not see you there." "I know," she said. "What is this water rights agreement?" Haverson looked uncomfortable. Denton looked like a man who had hoped to avoid this conversation. "It is a private arrangement between neighboring operations," he said. "It would not concern your situation." "If it involves the creek that waters my north pasture, it concerns my situation considerably," she said. She set down the flour she was examining and looked at him directly. "Who drew up the agreement?" "Art Bellamy, the land lawyer on 2nd Street. "And the new owner, Mr. Norris, declined to sign it." Denton's jaw tightened. "He said he needed to understand the full terms first." Edith turned back to the flour sacks. "That seems reasonable," she said, and said nothing more, because sometimes the most effective thing a person could say was the minimum required, and she had learned that from 28 years of living in a world that preferred women to say less. She found out later, from a woman named Clara Whitfield, who knew everything that happened in Caldwell within 48 hours of it happening, that Denton had been trying to acquire priority water rights for 3 years, and that the agreement he was circulating would effectively cut off secondary access to anyone downstream during dry months. This included Edith. This included the Brannigan, now Norris property. And this would have been very bad for both of them in a summer that the almanac was already predicting would run dry. She rode home thinking about it. She thought about it through the evening and through breakfast the next morning, and by noon she had saddled her horse and ridden north to the Norris property, which she had not intended to do but which seemed, on reflection, like the logical thing. The barn on the Brannigan property was better than her own old Hector had built well, and someone had recently repaired the roof of the main house. She could see fresh shingles from the lane. The garden plot near the house had been turned but not yet planted. There were 2 horses in the corral and a small herd of cattle in the south pasture that looked like good Texas longhorns, about 30 head. Luke Norris was replacing a board on the corral fence when she rode up. He looked up at the sound of hoofbeats and straightened, setting down his hammer. "Mrs. Atwood," he said. "Mr. Norris," she said. She stepped down from her horse and held the reins. "I heard you declined to sign an agreement Denton Holt has been circulating about water rights to Carpenter Creek." He studied her for a moment. "I did. I wanted to read it thoroughly first. I have a copy inside. May I see it?" He looked at her with something that might have been surprise, but was controlled enough that it came across more as recalibration. "Come in," he said. The house was sparse in the way of a man who had moved in recently and was still deciding what to keep. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a shelf with a few books, and a coffee tin. The copy of the agreement was on the table, and she sat down and read it while he stood near the stove and said nothing, which she appreciated. It took her 10 minutes. When she finished, she set it down and said, "This gives Holt priority rights from April through September. During a dry year, that is every month that matters." "Yes," said Luke. "It also includes a clause that allows him to sell or transfer his priority rights to a third party without consent of the other signatories." "Yes," said Luke. "That was the part that made me put my pen down." She looked up at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she was beginning to identify as his default, attentive, measured, not performing anything. "If we both refuse to sign, he cannot form a majority of the downstream users," she said. "The agreement requires majority compliance to be binding." "That is how I read it," he said. "You should know that Holt has been pressuring me indirectly for 2 years to sell my north pasture. A dry summer without water rights would make that pressure considerably more direct." Luke was quiet for a moment. "Then it seems we have a shared interest." "We have a shared creek," she said. "Whether that amounts to a shared interest remains to be seen." She stood up and picked up her gloves from the table. "But I wanted you to know that I will not be signing it, and that I believe Art Bellamy's involvement makes the legal framing worth challenging if it comes to that." "I agree," said Luke. "I have a letter going to a lawyer I know in Wichita who handled water rights cases in Colorado." She looked at him again with those gray eyes. He met her gaze without flinching or filling the silence with unnecessary words. "All right," she said. "Good." She was at the door when he spoke again. "Mrs. Atwood," he said. She turned. "You do not need to trust me," he said. "But I am not Denton Holt, and I am not any of the other men who have been making things difficult for you in this county. I am a person trying to run a cattle operation on land I purchased honestly, and right now my interests and yours happen to align. I am not asking for anything beyond that acknowledgement." She stood in the doorway for a moment with the Kansas wind at her back. "You said when you introduced yourself that you were being neighborly," she said, "and that it was not the same thing as offering assistance." "I remember," he said. "I do not need a husband, Mr. Norris," she said plainly. "I built this life without one, and I intend to keep building it." He looked at her steadily with something in his eyes that was neither hurt nor irony but something she could not quite name at the time. "I am not offering to be one," he said, "just a neighbor." She stood in the doorway one moment longer. "I trust that less," she said, and walked to her horse and rode south without looking back. She thought about it all the way home. She thought about the way he had said it, simply, without defensiveness, without the wounded male pride she had expected to see. And she thought about the way he had not filled the silence at the end of it. She did not know what to do with a man like that, and she had always been suspicious of things she did not know what to do with. The weeks that followed were busy, as late spring on the Kansas plains always was. Edith had her kitchen garden to plant, her fences to finish, 2 calves born in April that needed watching, and the butter business to maintain now that the weather was warm enough that careful handling was required. She did not ride north again, and she did not expect to see Luke Norris. but she was aware of a presence on the land to the north that had not been there before. The distant sound of hammer work some mornings, a thread of wood smoke against the pale sky, the occasional sight of cattle on the far rise that were not hers. She also received, at the end of May, a letter from the Caldwell Territorial Land Registry, informing her that Denton Holt had filed a formal petition regarding the water rights to Carpenter Creek, citing common usage rights that predated her ownership. It was a legal maneuver designed to pressure rather than prevail. She understood that, but it would require a response, and responses required time and money she had allocated elsewhere. She was sitting at her kitchen table reading the letter for the third time when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Luke Norris on her porch, hat in hand, holding what appeared to be a document. He looked like he had ridden hard. "You got one too," she said, looking at the paper in his hand. "Just this afternoon," he said. "May I come in?" She stepped back and let him in. They sat at her kitchen table, which was the table where she had made every important decision of her adult life, and they laid the two letters side by side and compared them. His was worded differently, slightly more aggressive in tone, citing trespass on his water access, but it was the same legal strategy. Holt was applying pressure from both sides simultaneously, hoping that one or both of them would yield. "He has been doing this for years," Edith said. "The legal filings are mostly bluff. But each one costs money to respond to." "I know," Luke said. "My lawyer in Wichita responded to something similar when I bought my first place in Colorado 8 years ago." The man filing eventually ran out of patience and money. "And you?" she asked. "I have patience," he said, "and I am careful with money." She made coffee. She was not sure why she did it, habit perhaps, or the fact that she had been sitting alone with this problem for an hour and there was something different about having another person at the table who understood the particulars. Not better exactly. Different. "How long have you been alone out here?" he asked, and then added quickly, "I do not mean that as an intrusion. I am trying to understand the history with Holt." 2 years, she said. "My husband died in the spring of '76. "I am sorry," he said, and it sounded like he meant it rather than like he was completing a social obligation. "He was a good man," she said. "Not always a practical one, but good." Luke nodded, and she had the sense that he understood the distinction between those two qualities. "My wife died in '72, he said. "Fever. We were in Colorado then, on a small spread near Pueblo." She looked at him with slightly different eyes after that. Not with softness. She was not yet in a place to look at him with softness, but with a different quality of recognition. She knew something about running a piece of land while carrying a grief that did not announce itself in public. "No children?" she asked. "No," he said. "We had not been married long." She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside, a meadowlark was singing in the tall grass near the fence line. "We should respond together," she said. "A joint response to the water rights petition. It establishes that we are both aware of each other's filings and that we are coordinating our positions." "Agreed," he said. "I will write to my lawyer tonight. Can you draft the response on your end?" "I can," she said. She had handled more legal correspondence in the past 2 years than most women she knew, and she was not modest about her ability to write a clear and persuasive letter. Thomas had always deferred to her on written matters. It was one of the practical ways their partnership had worked, even when the larger structures of it had not. Luke finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the door he paused and looked back at her with an expression she had begun to recognize, that honest, unhurried attention. "You have built something good here, Mrs. Atwood," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled at that. The almost was interesting. She noticed it. The summer came in hot and dry, exactly as the almanac had promised, and by July the creek was running at half its usual volume. Edith managed her water carefully, digging the channel on her property slightly deeper, and rotating her cattle's grazing in a pattern that kept the north pasture from being overgrazed. It was skilled land management, the kind her father had taught her on his farm in Ohio before she had married Thomas and come west at 24, and it paid off in that her cattle stayed healthy and her garden, though stressed, produced enough. She saw Luke regularly now, in the way that neighboring landowners see each other in busy times, at the shared fence line when one or both of them was checking it, at the weekly market in Caldwell where she sold butter and he bought supplies, occasionally on the road between town and their respective properties when their errands happened to coincide. They had fallen into a pattern of conversation that she could only describe as useful, which was a word she trusted more than most because it had no hidden rooms in it. He had taken to fixing the shared fence line without being asked, when he saw sections that needed repair. She noticed this, and the first time it happened she rode north and told him she would prefer he inform her before making repairs on shared boundaries because she liked to know the state of her own fencing. "Fair enough," he said. "The middle post section near the cottonwood was loose. I tightened it. I will tell you next time before I touch anything." She looked at the repaired section. It was solid work. "Thank you," she said, because she was not so stubborn that she could not say thank you. But yes. "Tell me first." "I will," he said, and he did after that. A knock at her door 2 weeks later. "The wire on the northeast corner has a gap wide enough for a calf to push through. I can fix it from my side or we can do it together, your call." She had said together because she wanted to see how he worked, and they had spent an hour side by side in the early morning fixing fence, and he had not talked unnecessarily, which she found rare in men and valuable in anyone. Clara Whitfield noticed, of course, because Clara noticed everything. She mentioned it to Edith over the fence one afternoon in late July, when Clara had ridden out with a jar of preserved peaches, and a friendly purpose that was also clearly investigative. "People are talking about you and the new man on the Brannigan place," Clara said, handing over the peaches with a smile that contained several questions. "People can talk about whatever they like," Edith said. "He is a handsome man, Edith." "He is a useful neighbor," Edith said. "We have a shared legal situation regarding water rights and a shared fence line. That is the nature of it." Clara looked at her with the particular affection of a woman who had known her for 3 years. "You know," she said, "not every man who shows up in a person's life is Thomas." Edith was quiet for a moment. "I know that," she said, "but Thomas was not the problem. The problem is the arrangement. Marriage in this territory is not a partnership, Clara. It is a transfer. The moment I marry again, this land ceases to be mine in any practical sense. I will not do that." Clara was quiet, looking at the land around them with a complicated expression. "You are not wrong," she said finally, "but you are perhaps a little bit lonely." "Everyone is lonely," Edith said, and changed the subject. She thought about Clara's words later, though. She thought about them at night when the prairie was dark, and the sound of coyotes carried on the wind. And she thought about them in the mornings when she sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and made the day's list of tasks that had no end. She was not going to pretend she did not know what she felt. She had always been too honest with herself for that. But knowing what she felt and knowing what to do about it were two entirely separate matters, and she was not ready to close the distance between them. The water rights petition came to a hearing in Caldwell in early August. Edith arrived at the courthouse on a Tuesday morning in her good brown dress, with her hair pinned neatly and her copies of every relevant document in a leather satchel that had belonged to Thomas. The courthouse was a plain wooden building on First Street that smelled of sawdust and ambition and served multiple purposes on different days of the week. Today it was a legal hearing room. Denton Holt was already there with Art Bellamy, who was a soft-featured man with careful hands and an expression of professional neutrality that Edith had always found irritating. There were 3 other landowners downstream who had signed Holt's agreement and were present in support of it. And there was Luke Norris, who arrived 2 minutes after Edith, with a man she did not recognize who had the bearing of a professional and was introduced as Mr. Samuel Treat, attorney at law, Wichita. Luke saw her and walked over. He looked at the satchel, then at her face. "Ready?" he said. "Always," she said. The hearing took 3 hours. Edith presented her documentation of historical water usage on her property, tracing her access to Carpenter Creek through the original land grant and subsequent usage records. Mr. Treat presented an argument that Holt's proposed priority rights violated established Kansas water law as interpreted in two prior territory court decisions. Bellamy argued that common usage had been superseded by the volume of Holt's operation. The hearing officer, a territorial judge named Calloway who rode a circuit through the county, listened to all of it with the patience of a man who had heard many disputes and had learned to locate the essential question beneath the legal language. The essential question here was whether Denton Holt's cattle operations' volume of use created a de facto priority that could be formalized retroactively. Judge Calloway found that it did not, that the historical usage records Edith had presented and the legal precedents Mr. Treat cited established that Holt's petition had no valid standing under current territorial law, and that the proposed agreement was not binding on non-signatories. Holt's face went red. Bellamy's expression did not change, but his careful hand stilled on his papers. Outside the courthouse afterward, in the bright August heat, Edith stood with her satchel and allowed herself a moment of very quiet satisfaction. Luke came up beside her. "You presented that beautifully," he said. "Mr. Treat's legal precedents were the deciding factor," she said. "Your historical documentation was the foundation he built on," Luke said. "He told me so on the way in." She looked at him. He was squinting slightly against the sun, his hat pushed back on his head, and there was something easy and genuine in his expression that did not require anything from her. She found that she liked it, and the recognition of that liking was comfortable and alarming in equal measure. "I appreciate your bringing Mr. Treat," she said. "We had a shared interest," he said. "You said so yourself." "I did," she said. There was a beat of silence in which Caldwell went about its business around them, and Edith was aware of being in a moment that had a particular quality to it, the feeling of a page turning. "Would you join me for supper?" he asked. "There is a decent place on Main Street. Mrs. Kepler's boarding house does a Thursday meal." She looked at him steadily. "It is Tuesday," she said. "They do Tuesday meals too," he said, and this time the almost smile was a full one, brief and honest and warmer than she had expected. She should have said no. She knew she should have said no, and she knew exactly why she should have said no. And she said yes anyway, because 3 hours of legal argument had made her hungry, and the truth was she did not want to drive home alone yet. Mrs. Kepler's was a clean establishment run by a widow of 60 who cooked with the conviction of a woman who believed deeply in the restorative power of a hot meal. They sat at a corner table with a checkered cloth and ate roast beef and boiled potatoes and green beans from the garden, and drank coffee, and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with water rights or fence lines. He had grown up in Indiana, he told her. His father had been a farmer, modest and hardworking, and Luke had gone west at 20 with the combination of restlessness and ambition that sent a certain type of young man in a certain type of direction in the years after the war. He had worked cattle drives, 2 of them up from Texas, before settling in Colorado with money he had saved and a head full of what he wanted. He had married Catherine, who had been the daughter of a rancher near Pueblo, and they had had 2 years together before the fever took her in a long, terrible summer. He had sold the Colorado place afterward and drifted for a while before landing in Kansas, where the land was cheaper and the soil was deep, and he was ready to try again. Edith told him about Ohio, about her father's farm and the way the land there was different, green and heavy with moisture, nothing like this dry expanse, and about coming west with Thomas, who had been full of hope and short on experience, and how she had learned to love this land on its own terms rather than the terms she had brought with her. She told him about the debts and the difficult winter of '76, and the morning she had paid the last one off and walked out onto her land in the February cold, and stood there for 10 minutes just to feel it was hers. He listened the way she had learned he listened, without interrupting, without redirecting to his own experience at the first opportunity, without the slight restlessness that most people showed when someone else was doing the talking. He was, she thought, an unusually good listener, and she trusted that less than she trusted almost anything about him, because she did not know what it cost him, and she had learned that everything generous costs something. "Why did you choose the Brannigan place?" she asked, specifically. He thought about it honestly rather than giving her the first answer that came. "The land," he said. "The soil in that north pasture is good, the creek access is reliable in a normal year, and Hector Brannigan built the structures with care. I could see that they were sound before I bought." He paused. "And it was at the edge of the trail," he said. "I have always liked edges, the place where one thing meets another." She looked at him. "The trail brings trouble," she said. "It does," he agreed. "But it also brings cattle, and cattle is my business." "Holt is not going to stop," she said, because they had not talked about it and she wanted to be clear-eyed. "I know," Luke said. "He will try another approach. He has patience for this kind of thing and he has resources." "I know," Luke said again. "But so do we. The word sat on the table between them after he said it, and he seemed to be aware of it too, because he picked up his coffee cup with the slight self-consciousness of a man who has said something true that he had not entirely planned to say. She looked at him, he looked at her. Outside, Caldwell moved through its Tuesday evening, and inside Mrs. Kepler's the candlelight was warm and the roast beef was good, and Edith Atwood was, for the first time in a long time, not entirely sure what she was going to say next. She drove home alone, as was appropriate, and as she had always intended. But the drive felt different than it had in the mornings and evenings before it, and she sat in the kitchen with her lamp burning and thought about the word "we" and the way he had said it. The thing about trust, she had decided somewhere in her 28th year, was that it was not a feeling. It was a conclusion. It was what you arrived at after accumulating enough evidence in one direction or another, and the evidence about Luke Norris was becoming difficult to ignore. He had not once suggested she could not manage her land. He had not once implied that her widowhood was a condition requiring remedy. He had not once looked at her land the way Holt looked at it, as a thing to be acquired, but rather as a thing she had built, which was different, which was actually entirely different in every way that mattered. But feelings were also not irrelevant, and what she felt when she was near him had begun to complicate the bookkeeping she had been trying to maintain between the practical and the personal. She told Cornelius about it the next morning while she was forking hay. Cornelius expressed his opinion with a long, skeptical look that she found oddly validating. The trouble came in September. It was not legal trouble this time. It came in the form of 3 men on horses who appeared at Edith's eastern fence line one afternoon when she was alone in her far pasture checking on her cattle. They were Holt's men. She recognized 2 of them from the cattle yard south of town, and they sat their horses on the other side of her fence with an intention that was not friendly. The lead man, a weathered individual named Corey who she had never exchanged words with, called out across the fence that Mr. Holt had an offer for her property and suggested it would be in her interest to hear it. The way he suggested it was not quite a threat. There was nothing she could have pointed to in a legal proceeding, but it had the quality of a statement that knew it did not need to be a formal threat to communicate the substance of one. Edith sat her horse and looked at them with the full weight of her gray eyes. "Tell Mr. Holt that my land is not for sale," she said. "And tell him that sending representatives to the far edge of my property when he knows I am alone constitutes harassment, which I am prepared to document." The men exchanged a look. "Mrs. Atwood," Corey said, in a tone that was almost gentle, "a woman alone has a hard time of it out here. Things happen. Fences need maintaining. Water gets scarce. A man in Mr. Holt's position can make things easier or harder depending on the circumstances." "I understand you perfectly," she said, and her voice was steady, which was something she was proud of later even though her hands on the reins were not. "Now get off the boundary of my property." They went. She watched them until they were specks on the eastern horizon, and then she turned her horse north and did not think about it too deeply. She went to Luke's place. She had not planned to. She rode north along the fence line with the specific intention of simply checking the wire, and she somehow ended up at his gate and knocked. He came to the door in his shirt sleeves, with a look that shifted quickly from neutral to alert when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him. Straightforwardly, all of it, standing on his porch because she had not gone inside. When she finished, he was very still for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I handled it." "I know you did," he said. "Are you all right?" She looked at him. The question was asking something different than what it was asking, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. "I am angry," she said honestly, "and I do not like being made to feel that my being alone is a vulnerability." "It is not a vulnerability," he said. "It is a fact of your circumstances that Holt is trying to weaponize, which is different." She looked at him for a long moment. The September afternoon was going golden and warm around them, and the meadows behind his house were the color of honey, and she felt something shift inside her that she could not quite name, but that had been building for months like water behind a dam wall. "What would you have done," she asked, "if you had been there?" "Nothing different than what you did," he said. "You handled it correctly." "What would you have felt?" He considered the question with the same honesty he brought to every question she asked him. "The same thing you feel," he said. "Angry that people like Holt exist. Angry that someone he stopped and started again. Angry that a person who has worked as hard as you have should have to deal with that kind of approach." She noticed the stop. She noticed the start again. She stood on his porch with the golden afternoon around her, and looked at this man who had come from Indiana and Colorado and the wide, turning world and ended up on the land that shared her fence line. And she thought about what Clara had said about loneliness, and about what she herself had said to Luke in this same doorway months ago about not needing a husband. "Luke," she said, and the use of his first name was the first time she had used it, and they both registered it. He looked at her steadily. "I have been suspicious of you," she said, deliberately, "because I have learned that the best way to avoid being hurt by expectations is to not develop them." "I know," he said quietly, "but you have been exactly what you said you were," she said, "and nothing more and nothing less, and that is," she paused, and honesty was the discipline she had always trusted, so she was honest. "That is almost harder to know what to do with than a man who was trying to take something." He stepped down off the porch so they were on the same level, and he was close now, but not close in a way that pressed, just close in a way that removed distance. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with it," he said. "I have learned not to tell you what to do with anything." "That is wise," she said, and she almost laughed, and the almost laugh broke something open in her chest that she had been keeping carefully closed. "Edith," he said. She looked up at him. "I am very fond of you," he said in that plain, serious way he had of saying true things. "I have been fond of you since the afternoon I first rode over and you were standing in your field holding a post-hole digger and looking at me like I was something you needed to evaluate carefully." "You were something I needed to evaluate carefully," she said. "I know," he said. "I am saying the evaluation appears to have been thorough." She looked at him for a long, full moment, and then she said, "I am very fond of you too, Luke Norris. And I say that with full understanding that it changes something, and I am not entirely sure it is wise, and I would like to be completely honest that I am still not looking for the kind of arrangement that involves someone else making decisions about my land." "I would not dream of it," he said. "Your land is yours. I have my own. We are neighbors, just neighbors," she said. He looked at her with those blue eyes that had nothing hidden in them. "I do not think that is all we are," he said. "But I am willing to let you name it in your own time." She reached out and took his hand briefly in both of hers and squeezed once and then let go. It was not a declaration. It was an acknowledgement, which was the kind of thing she knew how to give. He walked her back to her horse, and she rode south in the golden September afternoon, and the land looked different than it had that morning, which was not necessarily a thing that could be explained but was nevertheless true. The following weeks were a kind of dancing. which Edith had not expected herself capable of, but which turned out to be something she was quite good at. Luke rode south, and she rode north, and they met in the middle, sometimes at the fence line and sometimes at one table or the other, and the conversations moved between the practical and the personal in a way that had no clear border between them, which she found she did not mind as much as she had expected. He was reading a book about the water systems of the Colorado River Basin, which he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita. She borrowed it and read the relevant chapters on irrigation, and they talked about whether the methods described would apply to the specific geology of Carpenter Creek in a dry year. They also talked about Indiana and Ohio, and what it had been like to be young in places with more water and more certainty, and about what the West had taken from both of them and what it had given instead. One Sunday afternoon in October, she found him on his porch mending a bridle, and she sat on the step below him with her back against the porch post and read the letter from her sister in Ohio aloud, including the parts where her sister expressed concern about her being alone on the frontier and suggested she consider coming home, and Luke listened and did not comment on the sister's concerns, which showed good judgment. "She means well," Edith said. "I am sure she does," Luke said, pulling a stitch through the leather. "She does not understand the land," Edith said. "She cannot understand why a person would choose it." "Some people do not have that in them," he said. "The choosing of a hard place. There is nothing wrong with them for it." She looked out across his land to the south where her own land began, and the late October grass was the color of wheat and the sky was enormous above it. "I chose it," she said. "Even the hard parts. I chose it freely." "I know," he said. "It shows." She turned to look at him. He was pulling the last stitch through with concentration, his head bent, the line of his jaw clean in the afternoon light. She felt for him something that was warm and specific and located deeply enough that she knew it was not going away. "Luke," she said. He looked up. She took a breath. "I would like you to court me," she said. "Properly. I am aware that is an unusual way to say it." He set the bridle down. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it, not unguarded, because he was not that kind of man, but genuinely moved, in the quiet way of someone who has been hoping for something and has not allowed themselves to count on it. "I would like that very much," he said. "I have conditions," she said. "I assumed you would," he said, and this time the smile was full and warm and she felt it through the whole of her. "My land remains mine," she said. "Any arrangement we may eventually arrive at is equal in every real sense, regardless of what the law says. If there are decisions about this property, I make them." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "I may be difficult," she said. "You are already difficult," he said with great fondness. "I have found it consistently interesting." She looked at him for a moment and then she laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that lives in the chest, and he laughed with her. And the October afternoon held it and sent it out across the Kansas plains, where it dissolved into the gold and the wind and the wide, turning sky. The winter was the softest Edith had known since coming west. Not in weather. That winter was cold and hard-frosted by November, with ice on the creek and a snowfall in December that kept her indoors for 3 days, but in the quality of time, which had changed without her noticing exactly when the change occurred. She had firewood enough, and a well-stocked larder, and neighbors who came and went in the way that good neighbors do. Luke came south with venison in late November. He had gone hunting with a man from town, and she cooked it with dried herbs from her garden, and they ate at her kitchen table with oil lamps burning against the early dark, and she was aware that this felt very much like a life, which was something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. He brought her books from the Wichita bookseller, who apparently had a standing order now from Luke Norris that included a standing instruction to add something in the history or natural science category whenever available. She read them and told him what she thought with full honesty, including the one that contained a theory about Western water management that she found fundamentally flawed in its assumptions, and he agreed with her critique, and they spent an entire afternoon dismantling the author's argument together with considerable pleasure. Denton Holt made one more attempt, in January of 1879, filing a new petition based on a different legal theory that Mr. Treat identified and countered within 2 weeks. After that, it seemed Holt had decided that the cost of continuing was exceeding the return, and he turned his attention south, toward a different set of landowners who were less organized in their resistance. Edith and Luke received a joint notice in February that the petition had been withdrawn. She rode north to tell him, and he came to the door with the look of a man who had already heard and was pleased, and she stood on the porch in the February cold for a moment before he said, "Come in. It is freezing," with such straightforward warmth that she did. They sat with coffee, and she thought about how different this felt from the first time she had sat at his table and read that legal agreement. Everything was the same, the table, the coffee tin on the shelf, and everything was different. In March, when the ground began to soften and the meadowlarks came back, Luke rode south on a Sunday afternoon and tied his horse at her gate and came up the path to her house with his hat in his hand. She was in the garden plot, turning the earth for planting. She straightened and looked at him. He was serious in a way that was not worried, just serious, and she knew what he was about to do. "Edith," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know," he said. "I have known for a while," she said. "I have been thinking about what I want to say." He waited with the patience that was one of the things she valued most about him. "I will marry you," she said, "on the condition that we put in writing proper legal writing, drafted by a lawyer who is not Art Bellamy, that this land is jointly held, and that neither of us may make decisions about either property without the consent of the other. I have looked into it, and it is possible under Kansas territorial law to establish a property agreement that functions as a partnership rather than a transfer. It is uncommon. I do not care that it is uncommon." He was looking at her with an expression of such genuine and uncomplicated love that she felt it like sunlight on the face after a long, cold winter. "I will agree to every one of those terms," he said. "And Edith, I would not have it any other way." She looked at him for a long moment. This man from Indiana who had come across the wide turning world and ended up on the land that shared her fence line, who had never once tried to diminish her or own her or tell her what she needed, who had simply been present and honest, and exactly what he said he was. "Come here," she said, and he did, and she let him take both her hands in his, and she looked up at him in the March light with the fresh-turned earth of her garden behind her. He kissed her very gently, and she kissed him back with the warmth of a woman who has made a clear-eyed choice that feels, against all odds, like exactly the right one. They were married in May of 1879 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a small white building on 3rd Street that held about 40 people comfortably. Edith wore a dark blue dress that Clara Whitfield had helped her alter, with her hair pinned in the way she liked and her good boots, which were practical and looked well. Luke wore a clean suit that he had apparently owned for several years and maintained with the same careful attention he gave everything. Clara stood with Edith, and a man named James Hartley, who had known Luke in Colorado, stood with him. The property agreement had been drawn up by a lawyer named Alderman in Wichita and was signed and filed a week before the wedding. It established that the two properties, the Atwood place and the former Brannigan place, now the Norris place, now collectively and legally understood as the Atwood-Norris holdings, were jointly held in a partnership that required mutual consent for any sale, encumbrance, or major development. It was, as Edith had said, uncommon. Alderman had called it unusual, and then, when she had explained the terms clearly, had said it was sound and drafted it without further comment. She had paid his fee from her own account and felt entirely good about it. After the wedding, there was a dinner at Mrs. Kepler's boarding house, which had the best table in town, and Clara gave a speech that was warm and funny and made Edith laugh in that real, chest-born way. James Hartley told a story about Luke in Colorado that was embarrassing enough to be appropriate and charming enough that Luke took it with good humor. Edith gave a brief speech of her own that was composed of approximately 30 words and conveyed everything necessary, which seemed about right. They rode home together that evening to his house, the larger of the two, with the barn that Hector Brannigan had built soundly, as the Kansas sky went through every color it knew from gold to rose to the deep, deep blue of approaching night. Cornelius had been moved to the new barn that week, and had already expressed his opinions about the arrangement to Luke's horses in a manner that had apparently been tense, but was resolving. The first summer of their marriage was the fullest Edith could remember. They expanded the cattle herd, Luke's longhorns and 2 new calves she had raised from their own stock, and built out the garden on the south side of the house, and laid in a kitchen that had everything she needed, and some things she had not known she needed until she had them. The butter business continued, now with more milk to work with, and Luke proved to be genuinely useful in the mornings when she was making her rounds, not in a way that took over but in a way that added hands to tasks that had always needed more of them. She learned things about him she had not known. He was a meticulous record keeper, ledgers that were detailed and clear, and updated every Sunday evening. He was a patient hand with animals and could read the mood of a horse in the first seconds of approach. He woke early and was quiet in the mornings in a way that suited her perfectly, because she had always needed the first hour of daylight to be still before the day asked things of her. He made decent coffee and very good biscuits and terrible soup, and she cooked the soup, and he made the biscuits, and they did not argue about this or about much else, because they had both learned before they met each other that the things worth arguing about were relatively few. He respected her work. Completely and without performance, in the practical daily way that meant more than any grand declaration. He asked her opinion on land decisions, and took it seriously. He told the cattle buyer in Wichita that his wife handled the pricing on their joint stock, and would be making the decision on the sale. He read her letters to aldermen before they were sent, and trusted her analysis of the legal situation implicitly. It was the most thorough professional respect she had ever been given in her life, and it did not feel like respect in the self-conscious way of a man trying to demonstrate a virtue. It felt like the natural expression of how he understood the world, which was that capable people were capable and should be treated accordingly. She loved him, and the loving of him was not the complicated, tender-wound thing that her love for Thomas had been. It was clear and strong, and had the quality of something well-built, something that would hold its shape through the kinds of stress that Kansas and the prairie years would inevitably apply. He loved her with the same quality. She could see it in the way he moved through their shared days, in the way he looked at her when she came in from the field with her hair loose from its pins, and her boots muddy and her mind still on the problem she had been thinking about in the pasture. He looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in any landscape she appeared in, and he never said this in so many words because he was not a man who said things in many words, but she knew it, and the knowing of it was a warmth she had not expected to have access to, and was grateful for with the particular gratitude of someone who has gone a significant portion of their life without it. The autumn of 1879 was rich and full. Edith rode south to her original house, still standing, still maintained, now used for storage and the occasional night when she needed to be alone on her own land in the way she sometimes did, and stood in the kitchen where she had sat with her oil lamp and read legal documents, and made the decisions that had kept this land hers, and she felt the weight of everything that had happened in it and the gratitude of someone who had built something and held on to it. When she came back to the house she and Luke shared, she found him on the porch reading in the last of the afternoon light, and she sat next to him on the step and told him about the feeling she had had in the old house, and he listened, and then he said, "You should be proud of that." "I am," she said. "I am just making sure I do not forget it when the easier years come." "That is a wise thing to not forget," he said. I learned it from a difficult few years, she said. Most of the good things are learned that way, he said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the last light of the October afternoon and watched the Kansas sky do its extraordinary thing. She discovered she was pregnant in December of 1879, which she had hoped for, and which settled into her life with a feeling of rightness that surprised her with its force. She told Luke at breakfast on a Tuesday, straightforwardly, because that was how she told him everything. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so full that she felt the breath leave her for a moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "Completely well," she said. "Strong, actually. I feel very strong." He reached across the table and took her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. And she held his hand for a moment in the Tuesday morning kitchen, with the wood stove going and the Kansas winter white outside the windows, and felt the extraordinary, ordinary fullness of it. She continued all her work through the winter pregnancy, because she was healthy and capable, and had the good judgment to modify what needed modifying without being told. Clara Whitfield came out regularly, and a woman named Mee Cortez, who lived south of town and had delivered 7 children of her own, offered her time and knowledge freely, and Edith accepted both with the grace she had learned to apply to accepting help that was given cleanly. The boy was born in August of 1880, on a morning when the Kansas sun was already fierce by 7 o'clock, and the meadowlarks were singing outside the bedroom window. He was healthy and loud, and had Luke's blue eyes from the start, which was unusual because people said babies could not have eye color that early, but these eyes were unmistakably blue. They named him Thomas James Norris Thomas for Edith's first husband, who had been a good man even if not always a practical one, and James for Luke's friend who had stood at their wedding. Luke held the baby with the careful, reverent attention of a man handling something he values enormously, and looked at Edith over the small dark head with an expression that she understood was the counterpart of how she felt herself whole in a way that included rather than replaced every part of the life that had come before. "He is remarkable," Luke said. "He is," Edith said, with the proprietary conviction of a woman who has just done something impressive. "He takes after both of us, I think." "I hope so," Luke said. Clara, who was present, made a noise of happy agreement. Mee Cortez said the baby was well-formed and healthy and would be loud for some time, which proved accurate. Life with Thomas was loud and full, and had the specific quality of a house with a small child in it, which is a quality unlike any other in its combination of chaos and joy and exhaustion. Edith managed it with the same practical competence she managed everything, and Luke was the kind of father she had suspected he might be from the quality of his attention generally present, steady, interested in his son as a person from the very beginning, not waiting for the child to be old enough to be interesting, but finding him interesting at every stage. The cattle operation grew. By 1881, they had 120 head between the 2 pastures, and a contract with a buyer in Wichita that provided a stable income through the summer season. Edith had added a cream separator to the dairy operation, which had required a significant investment that she had researched thoroughly before making, and which increased her output enough to supply 3 establishments in Caldwell with regular deliveries. She hired a girl named Louisa, 16, to help with the dairy work in the busy months, and paid her a fair wage, which she had established by asking what the going rate was and then adding to it, because fair wages were the foundation of good work, and she had always believed that. She realized in the quiet of many early mornings, happy. Not in the way of someone whose happiness depends on the absence of difficulty. There was always difficulty, and the West served it in generous portions, but in the way of someone whose life is built on something solid. She had her land, which was hers. She had work that was real and producing. She had a marriage that was genuinely equal in every way she had insisted it be equal, and that had turned out to be not just satisfying in principle but deeply, daily good in practice. She had a son who was growing into himself with the combination of curiosity and stubbornness that she recognized from both sides of his heritage and found endlessly compelling. She had neighbors and friends and a place in a community that had been built on her own terms rather than assigned to her. She had, she thought, built the life she had set out to build. That did not mean it was finished. Life on the Kansas plain was never finished, and she was not the kind of woman who would want it to be. There were always new problems to solve and new decisions to make and new sections of fence line to check and new things to learn about the land and the water and the cattle and the people who moved through and stayed and left and arrived. She was not done. She was, in the deepest possible sense, only beginning. In the spring of 1882, with Thomas now a year and a half old and walking with the confident, slightly baffled stride of a child discovering that the world is larger than previously indicated, Edith planted the north garden with her new seed stock. A variety of winter wheat she had read about in an agricultural journal that Luke had ordered for her from a publisher in Chicago. And she stood back and looked at the furrows in the black Kansas soil and felt the good ache of it in her arms and back. Luke came up behind her and stood at her shoulder looking at the garden. Thomas was in his arms, pointing at things with the authority of a child who has recently discovered pointing. "Good lines," Luke said. "They are very good lines," she agreed. Thomas said something emphatic in the language he had developed, which included approximately 30 recognizable words and an extensive supplement of sounds that conveyed meaning through tone alone. The meaning of the current statement appeared to be positive. "He agrees," Luke said. "He has excellent taste," said Edith. Luke shifted Thomas to his other arm and reached out with his free hand and took hers, and they stood like that for a moment in the spring morning with the new garden before them and the whole of the land around them, and the sky above it doing its enormous, indifferent, beautiful thing. She thought about what she had said on his porch 3 years ago in the golden September afternoon about not needing a husband. She still meant it. She had not needed one in the sense of requiring rescue, requiring completion, requiring permission. She had built this without one and she would have continued without one and it would have been a good life. But this was also a good life, and different from what it would have been, and the difference was not subtraction. It was addition. Luke was not the solution to a problem she had had. He was something that had been added to a whole that was already whole, and the resulting thing was not a dependency but an expansion. And it was that distinction she had been protecting when she had stood in his doorway and declared herself, and it was that distinction he had honored from the beginning, and the honoring of it was the foundation of everything. She thought he probably understood this, because he understood most things about her without needing them explained. But she said it to him that evening after Thomas was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, because she had always believed that the things worth understanding deserved to be said aloud at least once. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up from his ledger. "I meant what I said years ago," she said, "about not needing a husband." He set down his pen. His expression was attentive. "I did not need one," she said. "I was quite right about that. And I chose one anyway, which is different and better, and I want you to understand that the choosing is what I value. Not the having, but the choosing." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was letting the thing settle properly before responding. "I understand," he said. "And for what it is worth, Edith, I have known from the beginning that you were choosing. I could see it every step of the way. And it has been the greatest thing in my life being chosen by you." She looked at him across the kitchen table in their shared house on their shared land in the middle of the enormous Kansas night, and she felt the word "we" again, the word he had said at Mrs. Kepler's that first time, the word that had sat between them, and it felt now not like something that had happened to her but like something she had built, piece by deliberate piece, the same way she had built everything else she owned. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "We always have," he said. "That is the thing about us." She smiled at him, and he smiled back. And outside the Kansas night was wide and full of stars, and the creek ran in the dark with enough water for all of it. Her land and his land. and the shared fence line between them that was no longer a boundary so much as it was a place where two things met and became, together, more than either had been alone. Thomas James Norris grew up on that land with the full weight of both his parents behind him. His mother's gray eyes and his father's blue ones combined in him into something greenish and changeable that looked different depending on the light, and her stubbornness and his patience combined into something that would serve him well in every place the world would eventually take him. He learned to ride before he could reliably write, and he learned to read before either of those things, because Edith had very firm opinions about the order of priorities, and books came first. By 1883, there was a second child, a girl this time, born in October when the Kansas trees were everything copper and gold, who they named Clara Jane Norris after the woman who had been a friend through everything and who cried with genuine feeling at the naming. Clara Jane had her mother's eyes precisely, no ambiguity, and had a nature so serene in comparison to her brother's energetic inquiry that Edith looked at her sometimes with a mixture of love and pure puzzlement, because she did not entirely know what to do with a child so constitutionally calm. Denton Holt sold his operation and moved east in 1882, driven out partly by a combination of poor decisions and partly by a dry year that his over-leveraged water operation could not absorb the way the Atwood Norris holdings absorbed it, because they had built with care and redundancy, and the long view of people who understood that a piece of land is a relationship, not a resource. She heard about his departure from Clara Whitfield, who mentioned it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been watching a situation resolve itself correctly for several years. Edith's sister from Ohio came to visit in the summer of 1884, her first visit west, and stood in the yard of the house on the Kansas plain and looked around at everything Edith had built and was visibly rearranging her understanding of her sister's life. She was a kind woman named Florence who had meant well with her letters about coming home, and she and Edith had a long conversation on the porch one evening that covered a great deal of territory, including the years of difficulty and the water rights battle, and the kind of man Luke was, which Florence was able to assess for herself over the course of a week, and arrived at the same conclusions Edith had arrived at 3 years earlier. "He is remarkable," Florence said. "He is," Edith agreed. "He listened to me for 2 hours about the church committee situation in Dayton," Florence said with wonder. "He listens to everything," Edith said. "It is one of his primary qualities." "Do you know how rare that is?" Florence said. "I do," said Edith. "I made him wait a considerable time before I admitted I appreciated it." Florence laughed. "That sounds like you." "It was very much like me," Edith said without apology. By the time Florence went back to Ohio, she had revised her position on the frontier entirely, and went back with a jar of Edith's best cream butter and a long letter for their mother that Edith had written out with the full accounting of her life, which was the kind of letter that required a great deal of thought and took several evenings to compose, and which she hoped would once, and for all settle the question of whether Edith Atwood had made a mistake coming west. A question that had been raised periodically by her Ohio family for a decade, and which she was now in a position to answer with considerable evidence in the negative. She had not made a mistake. She had made a life, which is a different and larger thing. The years settled into each other with the rhythm of seasons on the Kansas plain, the hard winters and the blooming springs and the long, gold-hot summers, and the crystalline autumns when the light came sideways across the grasslands and made everything look like the world had briefly become something that should be in a painting. The cattle operation thrived. The dairy operation expanded, and then contracted and expanded again in a cycle that tracked the markets and the weather in equal measure, and Edith managed it with the same attention and skill she had always brought to it. Thomas grew tall and curious, and eventually went to study in Wichita for a year, at a school that had opened there for young men of agricultural families, and came back with new ideas about land management that he presented to his parents with the earnestness of a young man who has recently acquired knowledge and is not yet sure if it will survive contact with his parents' experience. Most of it did, and some of it was genuinely new and useful, and the conversations around the kitchen table that winter were some of the best Edith had ever had. Clara Jane, who was as calm as her brother was energetic, turned out to have a talent for animals that exceeded even her father's, and by the time she was 12 was making decisions about the cattle herd that the hired hand, a steady man named Ruiz who had worked with them for 4 years, said showed better instinct than most grown men he had worked under. Edith told Clara this directly, because she had always believed that children should know precisely what they were good at and why, and she could see the slight brightening in her daughter's quiet eyes that meant the information had been received and stored where it would be useful. Luke was, through all of it, the thing she had decided he was in that September afternoon on his porch, exactly what he said he was, nothing more and nothing less. He had the quality that she had come to understand was the rarest one in any person: consistency. He was the same man on a difficult day as on an easy one. He was the same man at the courthouse as he was on the porch at dawn with his coffee. He was the same man when things went wrong and things went wrong, because this was life and it always does, as he was when they went right. She loved him with the specific love of someone who has looked very carefully at a thing and found it genuinely good, and he loved her with the love of someone who had watched her move through the world with her full attention and her formidable capability and her complicated, hard-won independence, and had found in all of that not a challenge to manage but a person to stand beside, which is the only love worth having. In the autumn of 1885, on a Friday afternoon when the light was doing its golden October thing across the Kansas grasslands, Edith stood at the northeast boundary of her land, their land, both properties now so intertwined in practice and partnership that the fence line between them had become not a division but a memory of one, and looked across everything she could see in every direction. To the south, her original 40 acres, the house where she had sat alone with her lamp and made her decisions and refused to give ground. To the north, the house they shared now, with its sound roof and its good barn and the garden that had expanded year by year with the things they had learned about the soil. In between, the fence line they had repaired together and the creek that ran through both properties with water enough for all of it, in this year that was neither too wet nor too dry, just the generous middle of what a Kansas year could be. Luke came up beside her on horseback, having come from the north pasture where he had been checking the cattle before the weather turned. He pulled up and sat his horse in the quiet way he had always had, reading the same landscape she was reading, and then he looked at her. She looked back. There was nothing to say that had not already been said or done or built, and so she said nothing and he said nothing, and they stood together on the land they had made theirs in the golden late afternoon of a Kansas October, with their history behind them and their future forward, and the wide, impractical, magnificent sky above them doing what the Kansas sky always did, being larger than anything under it, larger than the problems that had been solved and the ones that would come, larger than loss and hard winters and the particular difficulty of building a life on land that did not owe you anything. She was not finished. She had never been finished. But she was, in this moment and in every moment that had brought her here, exactly where she had chosen to be. And that, she thought, as Luke reached across from his saddle and took her hand in his, that was everything. That had always been everything. The choosing. The deliberate, eyes open, full knowledge choosing of a life and a person and a piece of hard Kansas earth that had asked for everything she had and given back something she had not known she needed until she had it. She held his hand in the October light and looked at her land and felt the fullness of it in every part of herself. And Cornelius, who was old now but still opinionated, brayed somewhere to the south in a tone that suggested he had thoughts about the whole situation. And she laughed, and Luke laughed, And the Kansas afternoon carried it all, the laughter and the wind and the meadowlark singing, and the sound of Carpenter Creek running clear and cold over its stones. Out across the grasslands and up into the enormous sky,